The morning sun blazed over Camp Harrison as Drill Sergeant Martinez watched 200 fresh recruits struggle with the obstacle course that had become their nightmare. For 3 weeks straight, not a single trainee had managed to complete the infamous Devil's Wall, a 12-foot concrete barrier that stood like an insurmountable fortress at the course's midpoint. Marcus Thompson, a 19-year-old from Detroit, hung from the wall's edge for the 4th time that week, his muscles screaming in protest before he dropped back to the muddy ground below. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he stared up at the seemingly impossible climb. Around him, dozens of other recruits nursed scraped knees, bruised elbows, and wounded pride from their own failed attempts. The wall had claimed victory over every single recruit who dared to challenge it. Some had tried brute force launching themselves at the concrete surface only to slide back down. Others attempted more calculated approaches, studying the wall's surface for any hint of a foothold or crack that might provide assistance. All had failed. Sergeant Martinez paced back and forth, his frustration mounting with each passing day. The obstacle course was designed to push recruits to their limits, but it was also meant to be conquered. The Devil's Wall represented more than just a physical challenge. It was supposed to teach teamwork, perseverance, and creative problem-solving. Instead, it had become a monument to defeat. Behind the training grounds, barely noticed by the struggling recruits, worked Henry Rodriguez, the camp's 62-year-old maintenance supervisor. Every morning for the past 15 years, Henry had quietly gone about his duties, cleaning facilities, maintaining equipment, and ensuring the camp ran smoothly. His weathered hands showed the calluses of decades of honest work, and his graying hair spoke of countless early mornings spent preparing the base for another day of training. The recruits barely acknowledged Henry's presence as he emptied trash, bins, and swept walkways around the obstacle course. To them, he was just part of the background, an invisible figure in coveralls who appeared and disappeared without fanfare. They had no idea that Henry had been watching their struggles with growing concern, his experienced eyes noting details that the younger soldiers missed. Henry had seen thousands of recruits come through Camp Harrison over the years. He had witnessed moments of triumph and crushing defeat, watched young men and women transform from civilians into soldiers. But he had never seen an entire group of trainees struggle with one obstacle for such an extended period. As Henry cleaned the area around the Devil's Wall each morning, he observed the recruits' attempts with the careful attention of someone who had spent his life solving practical problems. He noticed how they approached the wall, where they placed their hands and feet, and how they distributed their weight during their climbing attempts. What troubled Henry most was not just their physical struggles, but the psychological impact of repeated failure. He could see confidence draining from the young faces, replaced by doubt and frustration. The obstacle course was meant to build character, not destroy it. These recruits needed more than encouragement. They needed someone to show them that the impossible could become possible. The camp's training schedule was falling behind, and pressure was mounting from higher command to either modify the obstacle or find an alternative training method. Sergeant Martinez faced the difficult prospect of admitting defeat, something that went against every fiber of his military training and personal beliefs. As another group of recruits gathered at the base of the Devil's Wall for their daily attempt, Henry finished his cleaning duties and prepared to move on to his next task. But something made him pause and watch as Marcus Thompson, the determined young man from Detroit, approached the wall once again with grim determination etched across his face. Marcus Thompson stood at the base of the Devil's Wall, his hands chalked and his mind focused on what he hoped would be his breakthrough attempt. The other recruits had gathered to watch, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and skepticism. Everyone wanted to see someone succeed, but weeks of failure had dimmed their expectations. Taking a deep breath, Marcus launched himself at the wall with everything he had. His fingers found the tiny irregularities in the concrete surface that he had memorized during his previous attempts. For a moment, it seemed like this might be the time. He climbed higher than he had before, his muscles straining against gravity and his own weight. But just as Marcus reached for what he thought might be the top edge, his grip faltered. His chalk-covered hand slipped against the smooth concrete, and he fell backward into the safety net below with a heavy thud. The sound echoed across the training ground like a death knell for hope. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus lay in the net for several seconds, staring up at the sky, his chest heaving with exhaustion and disappointment. When he finally sat up, tears of frustration glistened in his eyes. The wall had beaten him again, and with each failure his confidence crumbled a little more. Sergeant Martinez felt his own frustration boiling over. He had tried everything in his tactical playbook: motivation through encouragement, motivation through discipline, and even bringing in specialized instructors to demonstrate proper climbing techniques. Nothing had worked. The wall seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to defeat every recruit who challenged it. "That's enough for today," Martinez announced, his voice heavy with resignation.
"Fall back to the barracks."
"We'll try again tomorrow." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, but he could see that pushing the recruits further would only deepen their demoralization. As the recruits shuffled away from the obstacle course, their shoulders slumped in defeat, Henry Rodriguez continued his maintenance work nearby. He had witnessed Marcus's latest failure and could feel the crushing disappointment that hung over the entire group like a dark cloud. What the recruits and their drill sergeant didn't know was that Henry had been making his own observations about the devils, all during his 15 years at the camp. He had seen the obstacle course evolve and change. He remembered when the wall was first constructed, and he had been part of the crew that helped install it. Over the years, subtle changes had occurred. Weather had worn away certain handholds, maintenance crews had repaired sections with slightly different concrete mixtures, and the wall's character had slowly transformed. What had once been a challenging but conquerable obstacle had gradually become something far more difficult. Henry also understood something that the young recruits had not yet learned. Sometimes the solution to a seemingly impossible problem required a completely different perspective. His years of maintenance work had taught him to look at challenges from angles that others might miss. That evening, as the base settled into its nighttime routine, Henry found himself unable to stop thinking about the struggling recruits. He had watched too many promising young soldiers lose their confidence on that wall. Tomorrow would bring another day of attempts and another day of failure, unless something changed. Walking through the empty training ground under the cover of darkness, Henry approached the Devil's Wall alone. He stood at its base, running his weathered hands over the concrete surface, feeling every bump, crack, and imperfection. His fingers traced patterns that his eyes had memorized from years of observation. In the moonlight, the wall looked different somehow, less imposing, more like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Henry began to formulate an idea, one that seemed so simple it was almost ridiculous. But sometimes the most obvious solutions were the ones that everyone overlooked. As he walked back to his quarters, Henry made a decision that would change everything for the 200 recruits who had spent weeks beating themselves against a seemingly impossible barrier. The next morning arrived with the same routine that had become painfully familiar to everyone at Camp Harrison. The recruits assembled at the obstacle course with the mechanical movements of soldiers who had long since lost their enthusiasm for the challenge ahead. Their faces showed the wear of repeated defeat, and even their formation lacked the crisp precision that had characterized their early weeks of training. Sergeant Martinez stood before his troops, searching for words that might somehow rekindle their fighting spirit. He had spent half the night trying to devise a new strategy, but every approach seemed doomed to the same failure that had plagued them for weeks. The Devil's Wall loomed behind him like a silent monument to their collective frustration. Just as Martinez opened his mouth to begin his morning briefing, an unexpected voice interrupted from the edge of the training ground. "Excuse me, Sergeant," came the quiet but confident words of Henry Rodriguez as he approached the formation. Every head turned in surprise. The recruits had never seen the maintenance supervisor interrupt a training session, and Martinez himself looked puzzled by Henry's unprecedented intrusion. The older man walked with the steady gait of someone who had made an important decision and intended to see it through. "I've been watching your recruits struggle with that wall," Henry said simply, gesturing toward the concrete barrier that had become their nemesis. "I think I might be able to help them understand something they're missing." Martinez's first instinct was to politely dismiss the offer. Military training was a serious business, and he couldn't allow civilians to interfere with established protocols. But something in Henry's calm confidence gave him pause. The sergeant had run out of conventional solutions, and his superiors were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the training delays. "With respect, Mr. Rodriguez," Martinez began carefully, This is a specialized military obstacle. These recruits need to learn proper tactical climbing techniques, not general maintenance skills. Henry nodded with understanding but didn't back down. I built that wall, Sergeant, he said quietly. I was part of the construction crew 15 years ago, and I've maintained it ever since. I know every inch of that concrete better than anyone on this base. The admission sent a murmur through the ranks of recruits. They had never considered that someone might possess intimate knowledge of their seemingly impossible challenge. Marcus Thompson, still nursing the disappointment of his latest failure, found himself listening intently to the conversation between his drill sergeant and the unassuming maintenance worker. Martinez found himself in an unusual position. Military protocol demanded that he maintain proper training procedures, but practical reality suggested that conventional methods were not working. The wall had defeated every recruit who challenged it, and time was running out to find a solution. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Rodriguez? Martinez asked, his tone suggesting cautious interest rather than outright rejection. Henry's weathered face creased into what might have been the beginning of a smile. I'm proposing to show your recruits that the wall can be conquered, he said. But I want to do it under conditions that will really make the point clear. The maintenance supervisor reached into his coveralls and pulled out a simple black bandana. I want to climb that wall blindfolded, he announced matter-of-factly. If a 62-year-old janitor can do it without being able to see, then these young soldiers should be able to figure out how to do it with all their advantages. The training ground fell into complete silence. The recruits stared at Henry with expressions ranging from disbelief to amazement. Even Sergeant Martinez seemed momentarily speechless at the audacious proposal. The idea that anyone could climb the Devil's Wall blindfolded seemed impossible, let alone a civilian, maintenance worker who was old enough to be the father of most of the struggling recruits. Marcus Thompson felt something stir in his chest, a combination of hope and skepticism that he hadn't experienced since his first attempts at the wall. Could this quiet man who emptied their trash and swept their walkways really possess the key to solving their impossible problem? Henry stood patiently waiting for an answer, the bandana held loosely in his calloused hands. His proposal hung in the air like a challenge to everything the recruits thought they knew about their limitations and possibilities. Sergeant Martinez studied Henry Rodriguez for a long moment, weighing the risks and benefits of such an unconventional demonstration. Around them, 200 recruits held their breath, sensing that this unexpected moment might change everything about their training experience. Mr. Rodriguez, Martinez said slowly, if you fail, it could damage morale even more than it already has been damaged. These recruits have been beaten down by that wall for weeks. Watching someone else fail might be the final blow to their confidence. Henry nodded with the calm understanding of someone who had thought through every possible outcome. Sergeant, I've watched these young people struggle for 3 weeks now. I've seen their confidence disappear a little more each day. Sometimes people need to see that what seems impossible is really just difficult. The maintenance supervisor paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the assembled recruits. But if I fail, then at least they'll know that even someone who built the wall can be beaten by it. Maybe that will help them understand that failure isn't a reflection of their character. It's just part of learning. Marcus Thompson found himself nodding along with Henry's words. The recruit had begun to take each failure personally, viewing his inability to conquer the wall as evidence of some fundamental weakness in his character. The idea that failure might be acceptable, even educational, was something he had never considered. Sergeant Martinez made his decision. All right, Mr. Rodriguez, you have my permission to attempt this demonstration, but I want it understood that this is not an official part of our training protocol. You're taking full responsibility for your own safety. Henry smiled and began walking toward the base of the Devil's Wall. I wouldn't have it any other way. Sergeant, he called over his shoulder as he moved. Recruits, gather around. I want you to watch every move I make, but more importantly, I want you to listen to what I'm telling you while I climb. The recruits quickly formed a semicircle around the wall, their earlier dejection replaced by intense curiosity. Even the most skeptical among them wanted to see what would happen when the quiet maintenance worker faced their nemesis under impossible conditions. Henry stood at the base of the wall and carefully tied the black bandana around his eyes, ensuring that no light could penetrate the makeshift blindfold. He tested the covering by moving his head in different directions, confirming that his vision was completely blocked. "The first thing you need to understand," Henry said as he secured the bandana, "is that this wall isn't your enemy. It's a puzzle, and every puzzle has a solution. The problem is that you've been trying to fight it instead of working with it." He placed his hands flat against the concrete surface, running his palms slowly across the texture. "Close your eyes for a moment," he instructed the watching recruits. "Stop looking at this wall and start feeling it. Your eyes are telling you it's smooth and impossible to climb. Your hands might tell you something different." Marcus Thompson and several other recruits actually closed their eyes, following Henry's instruction. They had spent so much time staring at the wall, studying its surface visually, that they had never really explored it through touch alone. Henry began to move his hands in systematic patterns across the concrete, his fingers probing every inch of the surface within reach. "Concrete isn't perfectly smooth," he explained, his voice calm and instructional. "When it cures, it creates tiny irregularities. Weather creates more. 15 years of maintenance have created even more." The recruits watched in fascination as the blindfolded man continued his tactile exploration of their nemesis. His movements were methodical and patient, completely unlike their own desperate attempts to simply muscle their way over the barrier. "The key," Henry continued, "isn't to overpower the wall. It's to find the pathway that the wall is offering you. Every climb is really a conversation between you and the concrete. You just have to learn how to listen to what it's telling you." With his initial exploration complete, Henry positioned himself at the wall's base, his hands finding what appeared to be his chosen starting position. The moment of truth had arrived, and everyone present understood that they were about to witness something extraordinary, whether it was a triumph or a failure unlike anything they had ever seen. Henry Rodriguez took a deep breath and placed his first hand on the devil's wall. The recruits watched in complete silence as the blindfolded maintenance worker began his impossible ascent. Unlike their own frantic attempts, Henry's movements were slow, deliberate, and almost meditative in their careful precision. His fingers moved across the concrete surface like a musician reading Braille sheet music, finding tiny imperfections that his eyes had memorized over 15 years of maintenance work. What looked like smooth, unclimbable concrete to the recruits revealed itself to be a landscape of subtle handholds when explored through experienced touch. "Feel for the aggregate," Henry called down to the watching soldiers as he secured his first grip. When concrete is poured, the heavy stones sink slightly, leaving small depressions around their edges. Your fingers can find purchase in spaces your eyes can't even see. Marcus Thompson stared in amazement as Henry's weathered hands found hold after hold on what had seemed like an impossible surface. The older man moved with the confidence of someone who truly understood the wall's secrets, each movement flowing naturally into the next. As Henry climbed higher, he continued his running commentary for the benefit of the mesmerized recruits below. "Don't fight gravity," he instructed, his voice remaining calm despite the physical exertion. "Work with your body weight instead of against it. Lean into the wall, don't pull away from it. Let the concrete support you." The recruits began to realize that they had been approaching the wall completely wrong. They had been trying to climb as quickly as possible, using brute strength to overcome the obstacle through sheer determination. Henry's method was entirely different. He was dancing with the wall, finding a rhythm that worked with the concrete rather than against it. Halfway up the 12-foot barrier, Henry paused to adjust his grip. For a terrifying moment, the recruits thought he might fall, proving that even his expertise had limits. But instead of slipping, Henry used the pause to demonstrate another crucial lesson. "When you feel yourself starting to tire," he called down, "don't panic and rush for the top. Rest where you are. Find a stable position and let your muscles recover. The wall will wait for you." Sergeant Martinez found himself as captivated as his recruits by the extraordinary demonstration unfolding before them. He had witnessed thousands of military training exercises, but he had never seen anything quite like watching a blindfolded civilian solve a problem that had stumped 200 trained soldiers. Henry resumed his climb with renewed energy, his hands moving with increasing confidence as he approached the wall's upper edge. The recruits could see that he was succeeding where they had all failed, but more importantly, they were beginning to understand why he was succeeding. "The last few feet are the hardest," Henry explained as he navigated the wall's most challenging section. "Your arms are tired, and the top seems so close that you want to lunge for it. But lunging will make you fall. Trust your technique, not your desperation." Marcus Thompson realized that he had failed at precisely this point during his own attempts. The nearness of success had made him abandon the careful climbing technique he had used to get that high, leading inevitably to his downfall. Henry's blindfolded ascent was showing him exactly where his own approach had been flawed. With a final, measured movement, Henry's hand found the top edge of the Devil's Wall. The recruits erupted in spontaneous cheers as the maintenance worker pulled himself over the barrier and sat on its upper edge, removing his blindfold with a satisfied smile. The wall was never impossible, Henry called down to the amazed soldiers below. You just needed to learn how to have a proper conversation with it. Now who wants to try using what you've just learned? For the first time in weeks, hands shot up eagerly throughout the formation. The recruits who had been demoralized by repeated failure were suddenly energized by the possibility that their nemesis could actually be conquered. Marcus Thompson was the first to step forward, his eyes bright with newfound determination and understanding. The impossible had become possible, and everything was about to change at Camp Harrison. Marcus Thompson approached the Devil's Wall with completely different eyes than he had possessed just 30 minutes earlier. Henry Rodriguez's blindfolded demonstration had shattered every assumption the young recruit had held about the impossible nature of the obstacle before him. Instead of staring up at the wall with dread, Marcus placed his hands flat against the concrete surface and closed his eyes, just as Henry had instructed. For the first time, he focused entirely on what his fingers could tell him rather than what his eyes were showing him. The transformation was immediate and remarkable. Where Marcus had previously seen only smooth, unclimbable concrete, his fingertips now detected subtle variations in texture, tiny depressions where aggregate stones had settled, and microscopic ridges created by years of weathering and maintenance. Take your time, Henry called down encouragingly from his position atop the wall. The concrete has been waiting 15 years to tell you its secrets. Give it a chance to speak to you. Marcus began his ascent using the techniques he had just witnessed. Instead of lunging desperately at the wall, he moved with deliberate patience, testing each handhold before committing his weight to it. His body worked with the concrete rather than fighting against it, and the difference was immediately apparent to everyone watching. The other recruits gathered around the base of the wall, their earlier dejection completely transformed into intense focus and encouragement. They could see that Marcus was climbing differently this time, with confidence, technique, and understanding rather than desperate determination. Sergeant Martinez watched the scene unfold with a mixture of amazement and professional satisfaction. In his years of military training, he had learned that sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected sources. Henry Rodriguez had just taught his recruits something that no military manual could have conveyed. As Marcus reached the halfway point that had defeated him so many times before, he paused to rest exactly as Henry had demonstrated. Instead of panicking about his position or rushing toward the top, he found a stable grip and allowed his muscles to recover while maintaining his connection to the wall. You're doing beautifully, Henry encouraged from above. Feel how the wall is supporting you right now. You're not fighting it anymore, you're working together. The watching recruits could see the truth of Henry's words written in Marcus's body language. The young soldier looked comfortable and controlled, completely unlike his previous frantic attempts. He was having the conversation with the concrete that Henry had described, and the wall was finally responding to his respectful approach. Marcus resumed his climb with renewed energy, applying each lesson he had learned from Henry's demonstration. When he felt the temptation to lunge for the top edge, he remembered Henry's warning about trusting technique over desperation. When his grip began to feel uncertain, he adjusted his position and found better purchase. The moment Marcus's hand closed over the top edge of the Devil's Wall, the entire training ground erupted in celebration. Recruits cheered, Sergeant Martinez grinned with pride, and Henry Rodriguez beamed with the satisfaction of a teacher who had just watched his student succeed. But Marcus's triumph was only the beginning. As he pulled himself over the wall and sat beside Henry, looking down at his fellow recruits with newfound confidence, a line began forming at the wall's base. Soldier after soldier stepped forward, eager to apply what they had learned from the blindfolded janitor's remarkable demonstration. Sarah Chen, a recruit from California who had never made it more than 3 feet up the wall, became the second person to reach the top. Her success was followed by James Wright from Texas, then Maria Santos from New Mexico. One by one, recruits who had been defeated by the wall for weeks began conquering it using Henry's patient, methodical approach. By the end of the morning training session, 47 recruits had successfully completed the Devil's Wall obstacle. The psychological barrier that had seemed insurmountable just hours earlier had crumbled in the face of proper technique and understanding. Sergeant Martinez stood watching his transformed soldiers with deep respect for the maintenance worker who had accomplished what months of conventional military training had failed to achieve. Sometimes the most profound lessons came from the most unexpected teachers, and Henry Rodriguez had just proven that wisdom and experience could triumph over youth and strength. Within 2 weeks of Henry Rodriguez's blindfolded demonstration, every single recruit at Camp Harrison had successfully conquered the Devil's Wall. The obstacle that had seemed impossible just days earlier became a routine part of their training, conquered not through brute force but through understanding and technique. Marcus Thompson became one of the fastest climbers in his unit. His early struggles transformed into expertise through Henry's patient teaching, but more importantly, Marcus had learned a lesson that would serve him throughout his military career and beyond. Sometimes the most daunting challenges require a completely different approach than the obvious one. The story of the blindfolded janitor spread throughout the military base and eventually reached the attention of higher command. Training officers from other facilities visited Camp Harrison to observe Henry's teaching methods and understand how a maintenance worker had solved a problem that had stumped trained military instructors. Henry Rodriguez found himself in the unusual position of being consulted on obstacle course design and training techniques. His 15 years of quiet observation and hands-on experience had suddenly become valuable military assets. But Henry remained the same humble, dedicated worker he had always been, more interested in helping soldiers succeed than in receiving recognition for his contributions. Sergeant Martinez implemented Henry's teaching methods into the regular training curriculum, ensuring that future recruits would learn proper wall climbing techniques from the beginning, rather than struggling through weeks of frustration and failure. The Devil's Wall retained its challenging nature, but lost its reputation as an impossible obstacle. The most profound impact of Henry's demonstration went far beyond the physical conquest of a concrete barrier. The recruits had learned that expertise could come from unexpected sources, that patient observation was often more valuable than aggressive action, and that the most impossible-seeming problems sometimes had surprisingly simple solutions. Marcus Thompson carried these lessons with him when he deployed to active duty 6 months later. During a mission in a mountainous region overseas, his unit encountered a cliff face that seemed impossible to scale. While other soldiers debated bringing in specialized equipment, Marcus approached the rock wall with Henry Rodriguez's patient methodology. Using techniques he had learned from watching a blindfolded janitor, Marcus found a route up the cliff that allowed his entire unit to advance safely. His commanding officer later recommended him for commendation. But Marcus knew that the real credit belonged to a maintenance worker who had taught him that impossible was often just another word for misunderstood. Years later, when Marcus became a drill instructor himself, he would tell the story of Henry Rodriguez to his own struggling recruits. The tale of the blindfolded janitor became a legend at military training facilities across the country, inspiring soldiers to look for wisdom in unexpected places and to approach their challenges with patience and understanding rather than brute force. Henry Rodriguez continued his quiet work at Camp Harrison, maintaining equipment and facilities with the same dedication he had always shown, but now he also served as an unofficial consultant for recruits struggling with various training obstacles. His office became a destination for soldiers seeking advice not just about climbing walls, but about approaching any seemingly impossible challenge. The Devil's Wall still stands at Camp Harrison, successfully climbed by thousands of recruits who learned Henry's patient, methodical approach. A small plaque now sits at its base reading simply, "Dedicated to Henry Rodriguez, who proved that the impossible is often just misunderstood." The real legacy of that remarkable morning when a 62-year-old janitor climbed a wall blindfolded was not just the physical conquest of an obstacle, but the demonstration that wisdom, experience, and patient observation could overcome any barrier. Sometimes the most important teachers are the ones we least expect to learn from, and the most valuable lessons come disguised as simple demonstrations of what seemed impossible just moments before.